The 18th Amendment to the Constitution effectively established the prohibition of alcoholic beverages in the United States. After ratification on January 17, 1920, crime rates soared as gangsters took over the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol. Respect for the law decreased, and corruption was rampant, especially in law enforcement agencies. 12 years later, the American people had had enough. A movement grew across the country to repeal prohibition. Grassroots support quickly began to build, and in February 1933, Congress proposed and passed the 21st Constitutional Amendment, and prohibition was repealed. It was the first and only time one amendment has been repealed by another. Until now. In 1913, the 16th Amendment established Congress' right to impose a federal income tax. That year, less than 1% of the population paid income taxes, and at the rate of only 1% of net income. Times have changed. Today, the Internal Revenue Service alone has a budget of almost $12 billion. And collects more than $2.5 trillion annually. The stated mission of the Internal Revenue Service is to collect revenues and to provide American taxpayers with top-quality service by helping them to understand their tax responsibilities and by applying the law with integrity and fairness to all. It has failed that mission. Over the past few years, the IRS has been used as a weapon, a crushing political weapon designed to purposely deny citizens and patriotic organizations the right to exercise and pursue their First Amendment rights. In this video, you'll hear from a cross-section of Americans, everyday Americans pursuing their own American dream and practicing their right of free speech. Americans who were moved to help their communities and make sure their children have the same opportunities they did, but instead were targeted, harassed, and bludgeoned by the IRS. Unfortunately, their stories aren't unique. Based on fact and evidence, IRS agents acting on instructions from yet-to-be-identified higher government authorities perpetrated what can only be construed as an orchestrated vendetta against citizens. Law-abiding, patriotic Americans were subjected to intense and unequal scrutiny and delay without cause or reason, based solely on their political beliefs. These citizens had the temerity to disagree with the direction their own country was taking, and who wanted to speak out against the Washington politicians. Some were educational groups who didn't even endorse candidates. Some were citizens advocacy groups who wanted to change Washington policies and educate their communities about how to accomplish those changes.
I never had anything whatsoever to do with politics prior to 2009.
I voted every year, every election, but really did not have any involvement.
Didn't really watch the news. I was homeschooling my daughter. I really didn't pay attention.
The thing that got us involved was the fact that things were getting out of control faster and faster. The banks were being taken over by the federal government. The car industry was being taken over by the federal government. In 2009, the deficit hit $1.2 trillion. It's just a set of things that came together that said, we have to act now.
We have to do something because this is getting very, very scary as to what's happening in our country. We decided, let's have a 4th of July rally. We had never done anything like that before.
Why not have something at our house where people can talk, figure out what we can do? We had like 40 people show up at our house. The entire kitchen was filled, the living room was filled.
My daughter and I made some flyers, printed off a bunch of flyers. We were hoping that we would have at least 50 people come. We had about 460 people show up. And in our small community, that was a significant amount.
It was a surprise. It was a big surprise to see all these people here because 50 is all we thought we would get, if even that many. Because when we did the sign making right down here, well, we only had like 5 or 6 people show up.
I remember
Really
sitting
paid off.
here waiting for people to come.
Yeah.
And at about 1:15, there were already like 100 people. And I remember just looking at you going, where are they coming from? They kept walking in, parking their cars, coming down. We were like, just kept looking at each other going, wow.
Yeah.
Where did those people come from?
I have no idea. There's people from everywhere.
There was a concern that because we were collecting money, we needed then to set up a bank account. But we felt like we needed to be accountable for this money to our people that were donating, but also to our government. We were afraid if we didn't sign up with the IRS, we would be in trouble. So we talked with one of our attorney friends who's a part of our Tea Party, and he suggested that we apply for a 501c4.
Hundreds of these groups applied to the IRS for tax-exempt status for their nonprofit groups. The process inside the IRS for recognizing such groups used to take 3 to 4 weeks. Yet, so deliberate was the political targeting of these patriotic Americans. The IRS didn't even follow their own rules for processing the applications. Instead, setting aside groups for special consideration, which had words in their names as Tea Party, or Patriot, or 9/12. And if their mission included making America a better place, or holding public officials accountable.
90 days is what the IRS says on their, when they send you the letter back saying that they've got the application, they say within 90 days you should hear something. The total duration from application to the time we received our status was 635 days.
For the first time, the IRS sent extensive questionnaires to the Tea Party groups, seeking massive amounts of information, documents, and burdensome filings, all because these groups were critical of the government.
I received this letter 439 days after we applied. It's kind of funny. When the letter came and I saw that it was from the government, it just kind of looked like junk mail. I had forgotten about the 501c4. It had been so long. I wasn't even thinking about that. I put it on my to-do pile, and I knew I was going to get to it in a couple of weeks, but it just sat there. I got a phone call from a fellow Tea Party organizer in Texas, and she says, hey, by any chance, did you get a letter from the IRS? And I remembered that letter sitting on the pile. So I got it out and opened it, and sure enough, it had the same type of questions that she was asking about. And so we began to brainstorm, and she already knew that a couple other organizations had received this same letter in the same time frame. So I called some more Tea Party folks that I knew in other states, and sure enough, within about 24 hours, we had identified 30 Tea Party groups that had received these letters.
The intimidating letters from the IRS demanded information that had nothing whatsoever to do with the facts relevant to an educational nonprofit organization.
The letter was a questionnaire asking again for about 80 pieces of additional information. Some of the questions, they started off wanting me to identify all of my donors, their names, and the dates that they'd given their donations. Now, 501c4s do not have to disclose donor information. So that was kind of shocking that the IRS is going against its own rules, wanting to know who my donors were. They wanted me to identify all of my volunteers, wanted names of everyone who'd ever helped us. For one thing, you do have so many volunteers that you can't identify all of them. But also, you feel a responsibility that you don't know where this information is going or what they're going to use it for. So there's no way I'm going to send a list of names to the IRS because I don't know why they need it and I don't understand what they're going to do with it.
The federal tax code contains about 4 million words. The entire original U.S. Constitution only had a little over 4,500. There have been at least 5,000 changes to the tax code just since 2001. That's pretty much a change a day. But not one word or one change tells the IRS it can purposely target American citizens based on their political beliefs. Yet, that didn't stop the IRS. George Brenneman is the leader of the Southwest Cincinnati, Ohio Tea Party.
From the get-go, the organization was formed as a nonprofit. It just wasn't under the 501 settings, which means we had a checking account. You had to manage which groups were contributing, how much they contributed, what they spent it on. If someone would want to donate or help us and they had a check, we would have them make it out to the Cincinnati Tea Party, which was the legal organization. And so we would manage it the same way you would a business. It would be made out to the business name.
Under that structure, donors' names and contributions were demanded by the IRS, something to which the IRS was not entitled as part of the application process. Many supporters were small business owners, and they were fearful of going against the current administration.
The rules around a 501c4 is that the majority of your effort must be social welfare. And that really fits what we were doing anyway. We're mostly an educational group. We talk about the issues, we describe how the Constitution's meant to work, how government's meant to work. It's very much an educational organization. In the time of elections like presidential or major midterm elections, yeah, for 2 months we may do some political activity, but for the other, 22 months of the 2-year process, we're doing exclusively education. So it's a perfect fit for what the definition of a 501c4 is. We're not trying to skirt any of the rules. It was a matter of that's the category the IRS actually told us to go into. It wasn't our thoughts to do that, it was our advice from them.
At a tax day event, over $12,000 in cash was raised and deposited in the group's bank account. Any cash deposit over $10,000 raises a red IRS flag. George knew that and wasn't surprised when the IRS wanted to ask questions about that money. He and his wife, however, were shocked at what the IRS really wanted 2 years later.
Our involvement with the IRS in a direct manner was a very strange happening. In the end of January, we got a phone call that was describing an account, and my wife does taxes for a living, and as she's talking to the IRS agent, the question is, which of the 600 accounts is this woman questioning? She then said, the reason you are being audited is because of your association with the Cincinnati Tea Party.
It wasn't an audit of the Tea Party accounts. It was a personal IRS audit of the Brennemans.
Our personal audit, we have 2 businesses and a personal account, so we literally had to go to the bank and get copies of every single deposit and expenditure and prove to the IRS all of the ins and outs of our personal accounts. And even though the audit was triggered by this deposit we had made on behalf of the Cincinnati Tea Party, they never asked a single question about the Cincinnati Tea Party. They didn't want to see those books. That account never came up. We did not have to prove anything with regards to the questionable deposit that started the whole thing. Typically, if you are triggered an audit because of a cash deposit, they will look in minute detail at that specific account. They never saw a single thing there. They never asked for anything. It was entirely to go after us personally.
Free speech is a right guaranteed to every American in the Constitution. The IRS must not have read that document, because they demanded Marion Bauer of Fremont, Ohio, send them a synopsis of the Constitution.
Synopsis, I think, is the federal word for book report. And my husband and I have been out of school a long time, and I decided I was not writing a book report even for the IRS.
But that was only one demand the IRS made after Marion and her husband founded a group called American Patriots Against Government Excess.
We chose to go with the educational format because we felt that unless people really understood what our country was, how it was founded, and what the basic tenets of what our founders wanted, there was no way that they could make wise decisions when they voted.
The process turned into 2 years.
December of 2009, we applied. They sent us a letter, which we received in January of 2012, but we had 10 to 15 days to respond, and I didn't get it until 2 days before the due date because I was out of town. I think between the questions and the subsets of questions, there was between 30 and 50 different answers. And there were very, very few that you could say yes or no. They wanted detailed answers on those questions. One of the questions that they asked was provide them a list of all speakers at your rallies or meetings and a written outline of what they said. We had some politicians that spoke. We didn't keep copies of their speeches. We had individuals that came up and spoke on different issues. They were just private citizens sharing their information.
And that was just the beginning.
They wanted to know if we had a Facebook page, what was on it, send them copies. If we had a blog, they wanted to know what documents we handed out to the public and to provide copies of any materials disseminated to the public at any meetings or public gatherings. They wanted information on what candidates spoke at our meetings or rallies, if they were campaigning or if they were just sharing information.
IRS Director Lois Lerner was at the forefront of these obvious violations of rights. She made sure groups with words like Patriot, Liberty, Bill of Rights, Constitution, and Tea Party in their names were targeted, bullied, hounded, and hassled. In May of 2013, Lerner admitted in response to a planted question that, indeed, for several years, the IRS had specifically targeted certain groups applying for tax-exempt status.
Instead of referring to the cases as advocacy cases, they actually used case names on this list. They used names like Tea Party or Patriots, and they selected cases simply because the application had those names in the title. Also, in some cases sat around for a while. They also sent some letters out. They were asking questions of these organizations that weren't really necessary in the type of application. In some cases, you probably read that they asked for contributor names.
And she blamed low-level employees in Cincinnati for the targeting, when she had been at the center of the targeting from the beginning.
After very careful consideration, I've decided to follow my counsel's advice and not testify or answer any of the questions today.
The outrage was vehement and widespread. Lerner's attacks and abuse of power were seen for exactly what they were: blatant attempts to curtail opposition to existing political agendas. And they weren't just general in nature, but specific. Not only were patriotic groups targeted, but so too were individuals who were either members of the groups or trying to make a difference on their own. Kevin Kookogee was singled out for retribution and intimidation simply because he was expressing his constitutional right to free speech.
When my children started to get to 7th grade, the oldest one, once she was in 7th grade, she invited some of her friends to our house. I began teaching Western civilization around the dining room table.
The next year, other students came out, and the word spread.
And then that expanded in the community. I began teaching other people in the community. Word of mouth sort of traveled. And it was a lot of one-on-one. It's almost like mission work in engaging the minds of the rising generation.
The goal of Kevin's group was to educate students on the linchpins of liberty being the foundations of moral and constitutional order. And as the group grew in size, Kevin realized it needed to be formalized as an educational and charitable organization in order to raise funds and spend them for that educational purpose.
In order to raise money, you have to form an organization. I had done for-profit businesses all my life for my clients, but I wanted to raise money in a nonprofit stand. It was a nonprofit venture anyway, that the whole style and nature of it was nonprofit. It lent itself to being nonprofit.
The plan was to raise money through public events with well-respected speakers that would engage local audiences.
The only prohibition for a 501c3, because I'm an educational organization, is that we can't endorse candidates, we can't electioneer, we can't get behind any of that, and that was never, nor would it be, our goal or our mission. We are an educational, true and true.
Kevin received a letter from the IRS with questions similar to those sent to other targeted groups.
My letter, on the other hand, contained probably 60, 70 subcategories. This was the first letter. It got worse. And the questions were very political in nature, asking me to identify the students that I was mentoring, some of whom were minors, under threat of perjury, but they also wanted to know the list of donors, which is illegal for them to ask. They wanted me to provide the political affiliation of my own mentors. Had absolutely nothing to do with getting tax-exempt status. But that was May of 2011. At that point, I thought it was the government against me. I knew they had a target on my back, but I had no idea that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations going through the same thing. So, I answered the questions that I felt were appropriate to answer, refused to answer the other ones or gave them answers that were within my rights, and tried for the next 6 months to get a hold of the IRS. No answers. They gave me phone numbers, I called, no answers. Voicemails, passed me on to a couple different agents.
Months later, Kevin finally got an answer to why his group was being scrutinized so stringently.
December 31st, 2011, I finally reach an IRS agent by the name of Ron Bell. And I ask him, very plainly, why in the world is my application taking so long? He was very humble and honest. He said, Mr. Kookogee, we've been waiting for guidance from our superiors as to your organization and other similar organizations. We have now received that guidance, and we will process your application on a first-in, first-out basis. Well, I knew immediately what was about to come, especially because I'd already received the first letter, which with its overly intrusive questions. I said, when will that be? He said, about 8 weeks. Well, almost to the day, mid-February 2012, I got the letter that I was expecting to get in that 8-week period, which was now a 90-part inquisition intended clearly to intimidate me. More questions about the students, more questions about donors and political affiliation, but it was so intrusive that I said to my wife, I'm being targeted.
Nothing got resolved, and not much changed, except for more questions and more scrutiny. Until May 10th, 2013.
May 10th, 2013 was the day that Lois Lerner issued an apology that was based on her knowledge that an Inspector General's report was coming that was going to expose the IRS for targeting us for our political views.
We know that the decisions to target conservative organizations were made not by low-level employees in Cincinnati, but at the highest levels of the IRS in Washington, D.C. After the May 2013 admissions, every time Lois Lerner has appeared before congressional committees and hearings on the scandal, she has responded like this.
I will not answer any questions or testify about the subject matter of this committee's meeting.
Lerner has continued to refuse to answer any more questions asked her by Congress about her involvement in the IRS scandal and cover-up. To this day, no disciplinary action has been taken against Lerner, with this small exception. The day after the May 2013 hearings, Lerner was placed on paid leave. Paid leave. Recent emails uncovered by the House Oversight Committee reveal that Lerner was planning to retire in October 2013. Yet taxpayers funded 4 months of paid leave just before her retirement, while she was under investigation for targeting individual citizens and patriotic groups. As for her retirement, estimates are her pension could be worth over $100,000 per year. So where does the buck stop? It's hard to tell.
The scariest thing of all here is that they're going after people that were trying, with their arms and legs and volunteer time, trying to affect change in America, which is what we thought America was all about. That's why we got together in the first place. And what we're finding now is that the government has grown so large that its first instinct is to protect itself instead of its citizens. And so now the citizens are considered the enemy anytime they want to shrink government, reduce the size, reduce the scope, put people back on their own 2 feet. The government now views that as, well, they're trying to get rid of us, and they have this allergic reaction to it.
We are patriotic Americans. We peacefully assemble. We petition our government. We exercise the right to free speech. And we don't understand why the government tried to stop us. I want to protect and preserve the America that I grew up in. The America that people cross oceans and risk their lives to become a part of. And I'm terrified it is slipping away. I'm a born-free American woman, wife, mother, and citizen. And I'm telling my government that you've forgotten your place.
The IRS is targeting American citizens for what they believe, what they stand for, what they're willing to fight for. Over the past several years, the vast majority of the targets were either conservative groups or members of those groups. But you have to ask yourself, if it can go after them, can't it come after me? Are you next on the IRS hit list?
The IRS abuses have to stop, and that will only happen with your help. I encourage you to ask questions and discuss what you've heard with your friends and your neighbors. The IRS scandals and abuse of power are not just conservative issues, they are American issues, and these actions by the IRS violate the Constitution of the United States. The only way to stop the IRS is to abolish it and replace the tax system with a fixed, fair, flat rate. It saves families and businesses billions in tax preparation fees. It stops the IRS from political targeting and silencing speech. It frees us from politicians who serve only their own interests instead of the public's. A fixed, fair, flat rate will reduce taxes. When we reduce taxes and at the same time reduce government spending, we can all have a chance to earn more and businesses can hire more people. We free people and the economy to do incredible things. As President Reagan said about reducing taxes, there is no limit to growth and human progress when men and women are free to follow their dreams. Is a constitutional amendment an easy thing to pull off? No, of course not. But when I think of doing it, I'm reminded of President John F. Kennedy. He said we could send man to the moon in a decade, and we did. When people asked him why he'd even dare attempt such a difficult thing, Kennedy said, "We do these things not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. To amend the Constitution, to revamp our tax code, that's a challenge we are willing to accept and one we will win." Our lofty mission starts on the ground with us. We need to teach our friends and family that it can be done. We need to make our case to our state legislatures and to Congress. It's not rocket science. We will do this. That's why I'm urging you to sign the petition today in support of a new constitutional amendment, Amendment 28, to repeal the 16th Amendment and get rid of the abusive IRS as we know it. Oklahoma's Congressman Jim Bridenstine has introduced House Joint Resolution 104. We need to show massive support for this resolution. It takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to the states, and then 3/4 of the states must ratify the amendment. When corruption ran rampant after Prohibition, Americans rose up and fought back. Now it's our turn. Corruption is here again. We know what must be done, and we are starting the process right now to end the IRS abuse. It's time to repeal the 16th Amendment and do away with the current corrupt culture at the IRS. It's time for Amendment 28. Thank you for taking the first step in this historic challenge.